A convicted killer was already sitting in prison when he wrote a letter claiming he had committed the crime. He didn't just confess. He gave investigators details about the attack that were supposed to be known only by the person who had been there. And then he wrote something even more disturbing. He said the man serving the sentence was innocent. That man's name was Tim Cole. He was a young Texas Tech student, a military veteran, and a son who had always maintained that he had never attacked anyone. But despite another prisoner claiming responsibility for the crime, Tim remained behind bars. He would spend years insisting on his innocence. And before modern DNA testing could finally prove the truth, Tim Cole would die in prison. He would never see the evidence that eventually cleared his name. So how did an innocent man end up serving 25 years for a crime committed by someone else? And how could the system receive a confession from the real offender and still fail to free him? To understand that, we have to go back to a dark night in Lubbock, Texas in 1985. March 24th, 1985, Lubbock, Texas. It was the kind of night that should have ended like any other night on a college campus. But for 24-year-old Texas Tech student Michele Mallin, everything changed in a matter of moments. Michele was walking toward her car in a campus parking lot when a man suddenly appeared. He forced his way into the vehicle. What followed was a terrifying attack. When it was over, the attacker disappeared into the darkness, leaving Michele alive, but deeply traumatized. Within hours, the campus was no longer simply a place where students went to class. It was a place where people were afraid. Students wanted answers, the community wanted an arrest, and police needed to find the person responsible. Investigators began working the scene and collecting whatever evidence they could recover. But the most important evidence would not come from a dramatic fingerprint or a weapon left behind. It would come from the victim's memory. Michele described her attacker, and among the details she remembered was one that would later become incredibly important. The man she described smoked cigarettes during the attack. Police now had a description. They needed a suspect. And before long, their attention turned toward a young man who seemed, at first, to have little connection to the crime. His name was Timothy Cole. Tim was a military veteran. He was a Texas Tech student. He had no history of violent crime. And there was something else investigators should have noticed immediately. Tim suffered from severe asthma. He didn't smoke. Yet within days, his photograph would be placed in a lineup, and Michele would point to it. The investigation had found its suspect, but it had not found the truth. Tim Cole did not look like a man preparing to run from the police. When investigators questioned him, he cooperated. He didn't try to disappear. He didn't invent an elaborate story. He told them where he had been. He maintained that he had been at home studying and spending time with his family. His mother and brother supported his account. And Tim repeatedly insisted that he had never committed the attack. But there was one detail that seemed especially difficult to reconcile. The attacker had reportedly smoked during the assault. Tim had severe asthma. Smoking was not something he could simply tolerate. Yet the investigation had already begun moving in one direction, toward Tim. Once Michele identified his photograph, that identification became powerful. And this is where the case took a dangerous turn. An eyewitness can be completely sincere and still be wrong. Trauma can affect memory. Fear can alter perception. And when investigators become convinced that they have found the right person, every new piece of information can begin to look like confirmation. Instead of asking, what if this isn't our man? The investigation increasingly centered on, how do we prove that it is? Tim's innocence became a problem the system had to explain. His lack of physical connection to the crime became something the prosecution could work around, and the eyewitness identification became the center of the case. By 1986, Tim Cole was standing inside a courtroom. He was about to learn how much weight a single identification could carry. The courtroom was supposed to be where the uncertainty ended. Instead, it became the place where one mistaken belief became a life sentence. Michele Mallin identified Tim Cole in court. To the jury, her certainty carried enormous emotional weight. The defense challenged the identification. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence tying Tim to the crime. There were no fingerprints connecting him to the attack. There was no forensic evidence establishing that Tim was the perpetrator. And there were details in the original description that did not fit him. But the prosecution had something that was difficult for a jury to ignore. A victim pointing directly at the defendant. Tim was convicted. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. And just like that, a 26-year-old veteran and university student became a prisoner. As he was taken away, Tim turned toward his family. He knew something the verdict could not change. He was innocent. He had not committed the crime. And he refused to confess to something he had not done. But inside the Texas prison system, innocence would not automatically set him free. If anything, it could make his life harder. Because parole can be easier when a prisoner accepts responsibility. Tim refused. He would not trade the truth for his freedom, so he stayed in prison. And somewhere beyond those prison walls, the real story of what happened in that parking lot was still waiting to emerge. 9 years passed. Tim Cole remained in prison. Then, in 1995, something happened that should have stopped the entire case in its tracks. A letter arrived. It came from another prisoner. His name was Jerry Wayne Johnson. Johnson was already serving a long sentence for violent sexual offenses in Texas, and now he was claiming responsibility for the crime that had sent Tim Cole to prison. At first, a confession from another inmate might have been dismissed as attention-seeking. But Johnson didn't simply say, "I did it." He described details about the crime, details connected to the location, details about the attack, details that investigators could compare against what was already known. And Johnson made his claim unmistakable. Tim Cole was innocent. Johnson was saying that he was the man responsible. Think about what that meant. A man was sitting in prison for a crime. Another prisoner was writing to authorities and saying, "You have the wrong man. I did it." The obvious next step should have been to reopen the case. But the system did not move as quickly as the truth demanded. The letters did not immediately bring Tim home. The conviction remained. Tim remained behind bars, and the clock kept moving. He had already lost nearly a decade of his life. Now the question was no longer simply, was Tim Cole innocent? The question was far more disturbing. What happens when the justice system is given a chance to correct its mistake, and still doesn't? Inside prison, Tim continued doing something remarkably simple. He kept saying the same thing. He was innocent. He could have told the parole system what it wanted to hear. He could have accepted responsibility. He could have said he was sorry. He could have tried to make the system believe that he had changed. But there was one problem. Everything would have been a lie. Tim had spent years behind bars for a crime he said he never committed. Now he was being asked, in effect, to admit to it if he wanted a better chance at freedom. He refused. For Tim, the choice was brutal but clear. He would rather remain imprisoned as an innocent man than walk free by claiming to be guilty. Then came December 2nd, 1999. Tim Cole was still in prison. He was only 39 years old. His asthma had always been a serious part of his life. That day, Tim suffered a fatal asthma attack. He died behind bars, not as a free man, not as an exonerated man, but as a convicted felon. The man who had spent years saying he was innocent never got to see the evidence that would eventually prove him right. His family was devastated, but they refused to let his story end there. His mother, Ruby Cole, and his brother, Corey Session, continued fighting. Tim was gone, but the question remained. Was the biological evidence from 1985 still somewhere in the system? And if it was, could it finally tell the truth? Years after Tim's death, modern DNA technology offered something the original investigation never had: a way to test the biological evidence again. The evidence from the 1985 crime had survived, and now investigators could examine it using forensic techniques that were unavailable when Tim was convicted. The question was brutally simple. Did the DNA belong to Tim Cole? The answer was no. The biological evidence excluded Tim. The man who had spent years behind bars was not the source of the DNA connected to the attack. But there was another question. If it wasn't Tim, whose DNA was it? The answer led investigators back to the man who had been writing letters from prison years earlier, Jerry Wayne Johnson. The DNA evidence connected Johnson to the crime. The man who had claimed responsibility was not simply telling a story. The science was now backing up what he had been saying. Tim Cole had been wrongfully convicted. The physical evidence had finally broken through the wall that eyewitness certainty had built. And then came another painful moment. Michele Mallin learned what the DNA had revealed. The woman whose identification had helped send Tim to prison now knew that she had identified the wrong man. But she did not run from that truth. She expressed remorse. And she joined Tim's family in seeking justice and reform. For years, the case had been about a single question. Was Tim Cole the attacker? Now science had answered it. No. But there was still one final question. What could the state do for a man who had died before it admitted that it was wrong? Tim Cole would never walk out of prison. He would never hear a judge say that he was innocent. He would never see his family celebrate his freedom. But his name could still be restored. The legal battle continued after his death. The DNA evidence had changed the case from a question of belief into a question of science. Tim had not committed the crime. Jerry Wayne Johnson was connected to the biological evidence, and the conviction that had defined Tim's life could no longer stand as the final word. In 2009, Tim Cole received a posthumous exoneration. The truth had finally entered the official record. Then, in 2010, Texas Governor Rick Perry granted Tim Cole a posthumous pardon. It was a historic moment, but it was also painfully late. The pardon could restore Tim's name. It could not restore his lost years. It could not give him back his youth. It could not give his family back the son and brother they had lost. And it could not erase the fact that Tim had died before justice arrived. But something else came from his case. Texas began changing the way it approached wrongful convictions and eyewitness identification. Tim Cole's name would become attached to reforms designed to reduce the possibility that another innocent person would suffer the same fate. Tim Cole entered the Texas prison system as a young man. He left this world without ever leaving prison. For years, the system had treated an eyewitness identification as certainty. It had treated a conviction as final, and it had left a young veteran to prove his innocence from behind bars. Then a prisoner wrote a confession. Years later, DNA confirmed what Tim had been saying all along. He was innocent. The real offender had been identified, and Tim's name was finally cleared. His story also helped push Texas toward reforms involving wrongful convictions, eyewitness identification, and the preservation of evidence. A statue now stands in Lubbock honoring his memory. But perhaps the most important part of Tim Cole's story isn't the statue. It isn't the pardon. It isn't even the DNA. It's the fact that Tim never changed his story. From the beginning, he said he didn't do it. He kept saying it in court. He kept saying it in prison. He kept saying it when admitting guilt might have made his life easier. And eventually, the evidence said the same thing. Tim Cole was telling the truth. The tragedy is that the truth arrived after he was gone. For Tim, justice came too late. But his story left behind a warning that still matters today. A confident eyewitness can be wrong. A conviction can be wrong. And when a justice system stops questioning its first answer, an innocent person can spend years paying for someone else's crime. Tim Cole never got to walk free, but eventually, the truth did. And that truth changed his name, from convicted killer to innocent man.